FRBM Act. So suppose you get this question in the paper, what do you understand by the FRBM Act? Explain its importance in brief. And state some problems in FRBM Act and suggest some solutions. Well, my suggestion is that always prepare little more than what is required in the question. So whatever I'm writing, it is not necessarily just the answer to this question, but it can be used in some other way also, wherever you think it is right. So don't treat it like it as a question answer format, but I'm giving you a brief overview of the FRBM Act and what is its importance and what are some problems with the FRBM Act. So whether the question comes, does FRBM Act needs some changes? So this problems part could be termed as in terms of changes. So you have to understand carefully. They can state the question in whichever way, but whatever you have prepared, try to mold it in the way the question is being asked. Anyhow. Okay, I'll give you the brief overview of the question. So it is asking you, what is the main objective of the Act? What is the main purpose of the Act? So the main purpose was that it wanted to eliminate the revenue deficit of the country and to bring down the fiscal deficit to just 3% of GDP. That's a manageable limit by the year March 2008. Of course, there were revisions even after this. I've also discussed what is the revenue deficit and what is the fiscal deficit. Now, the basic idea was that this act wanted to bring about the fiscal stability in the country in the long run. It wanted to bring about the transparency in the fiscal management of the country. And it also wanted to bring about the government's accountability. Because every year in the budget, they would have to tell whether they have met this target or not. Then the other things are that what are the different usefulness of the act? Well, of course, it is seen as the way of restraining the huge government spending. It is seen as the way of eliminating the revenue deficit and decreasing the fiscal deficit. That's always there. One. Secondly, it has brought about the accountability in the government's actions as far as the fiscal management is concerned. And you also have a better view of the fiscal affairs of the country because the government would have to present this thing in the budget every year. And you also come to know about the long-term fiscal trajectory of the country with the help of this act. It gives you some idea of what could be the long-term fiscal trajectory of the country. Then there were several problems also. The first problem was the act is much more focused only on the union budget. It is not looking at the public sector borrowing requirements. It should also look at that. Over the years, the public sector borrowing requirement has increased and the fiscal deficit has decreased. And in fact, the public sector borrowing requirement is even more than the fiscal deficit. First thing is that. Secondly, whenever you are fixing the fiscal targets, it has to be seen in a perspective. So, and those perspectives will come through looking at the macroeconomic situation. Well, you are saying that the central government's debt should be 40% of the GDP, right? I think 40% of GDP. Well, you've got this target by looking at the other emerging nations. Those other emerging nations, on an average, they have 40% of their this was their debt to GDP ratio, let's say. We have around 60% of debt to GDP ratio. But you also have to look at this, that those emerging nations, they have the lower growth as compared to what we have right now. So even this is important. So with a higher growth, we can also sustain the higher amount of debts. So they're not always bad. Then they said this, that you also need to be much more flexible in the fiscal targets. What do you mean by this? You said this, that you wanted to have the fiscal deficit of just 3% of GDP, right? Now supposedly there is a cyclical downturn. If there is a cyclical downturn, then what happens is that the revenues would also be lower. When revenues are going to be lower and you want to meet the fiscal deficit target, you would want to reduce the expenditures also. When you want to reduce the expenditures, when expenditures are reduced, it will lead to lower growth again. So this becomes a perpetuating thing. So then they can be a cyclically adjusted fiscal targets, fiscal deficit targets, which could be used. But again, in terms of, in case of, or in the situations where the quarterly data is highly unreliable, you may not be able to use it well. And then they said this, that there can be some kind of an escape route. That is, sometimes in some situations, you may not be able to meet the fiscal deficit target which you have thought of. So there should be some escape routes which should be available. So what are those escape routes? War happens. Situation like COVID happens, right? For example, you have done such a huge structural reforms and they have some very unanticipated fiscal implications. So in those cases also, you can just get away. And in case if there is a lower growth for so many quarters, then also there should be an escape route which is available. So this is just an overview of what's going on in the recording. Now you please listen to that. Thank you, Vita. Now, guys, this act, FRBM Act, (2003), initially the main purpose of this act was that it has to eliminate the revenue deficit of the country and bring down the fiscal deficit to a manageable 3% of GDP, right? That was the main idea of this act. I'll tell you what revenue deficit and fiscal deficits are. So please write the main purpose of this act. Main purpose of this act was to eliminate revenue deficit of the country plus bring down fiscal deficit to a manageable 3% of GDP by March 2008. Of course, I mean, this limit, it changed a little bit. This was also given up during some years, and then again it came back, this act. So this was the main purpose of this act, that is to eliminate the revenue deficit and to bring down the fiscal deficit by to a manageable 3% of GDP. Now the question arises, what is revenue deficit? You have a different or a separate recording for the types of deficits, but let us just, in very brief, let's talk about what is the revenue deficit. Revenue deficit is the excess of government's revenue how come this has gone red, everything? Excess of government's revenue expenditure over its revenue receipts, right? So revenue deficit actually tells you that the government does not have sufficient revenue for the normal functioning of the government, right? So there are something which is called revenue expenditure and something which is called revenue receipt. Revenue receipts could be receipts from tax, for example, direct tax, indirect tax, or receipts from non-tax revenue. While revenue expenditure could be, for example, the salaries of the government employees, maybe. So all of these are the revenue expenditure. So what they were saying is that we do not want a situation in which revenue expenditure is more than the revenue receipts. That's what they said, right? What about fiscal deficit? What do you mean by fiscal deficit? So this fiscal deficit, it is the excess of government's total expenditure over its total receipts. And this excludes borrowing, right? So the gross fiscal deficit is, you have the total expenditure with you. From this, you will deduct the revenue receipts, you will deduct the non-debt creating capital receipts, right? So basically, this is telling you what are the borrowing requirements of the government. So you would want it to be just 3% of the GDP by March 2008, right? Well, then you have, it has been stated, the main objectives, probably you can write in this particular fashion. So what are the main objectives of the FRBM Act? One, it wanted to introduce the transparent fiscal management system in the country, right? So there should be transparency in the fiscal management system. So what government is doing, what is its expenditure, what are its borrowing requirements, whatever. So it should be transparent enough. It should, since it becomes an act, then every government would be responsible to maintain this, and hence it would have to tell this in the parliament that what are its expenditures, revenues, everything, and there will be transparency in the fiscal management system. So the first thing was to introduce transparent fiscal management system, right? Then you would want that the distribution of countries' debts, whatever country is taking as debt, it should be more equitable. I mean, it should not happen that you're taking debt, too much of debt in one particular year. So it should be distributed equitably over the years, right? It should have a manageable distribution throughout different years, right? To introduce a more equitable and manageable distribution of countries' debt over the years, right? And basically it meant that the country should have the fiscal stability in the long run. That is So basically this act, it intends that it would bring some transparency in accountability in the conduct of the fiscal and the monetary actions of the government. So whatever was happening maybe just behind the scenes, so every government was made now accountable to it, that you cannot go beyond 3% of GDP in your fiscal deficit. Of course, there were years when government had to borrow more, government had to do its more expenditures in order to have in order to have the smooth functioning. But again, you need to give reasons why exactly you did that. Secondly, for example, in the situation like COVID, there are many states which are asking that you should relax this assumption more. I mean, you should relax this, that you can give more room to us, that you can go beyond the 3% of the fiscal deficit. So that's what is a reasonable thing. Well, they have set the targets in the FRBM Act 2003, and this called for phased reduction of the fiscal deficit. So there was phased reduction. It was not like, for example, if they started in 2003, then in the next year itself it should be 3%. No, I mean, supposedly if they were starting at 6%, then it will come down to 5%, maybe to 4.5%, then 3%, and then gradually, right? It is a phased reduction. So it aimed for phased reduction. Of fiscal deficit to acceptable limits. Well, you know what? They said this, that, I mean, very recently, they would require that the government should limit the fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP by March 2021, which in the present scenario doesn't seem to be that they can probably have this. And the debt of the central government to just 40% of GDP by 2024-25. This is the present scenario I'm telling you. So, well, it provides room that you can deviate from these targets. So, right now, the limits which they set was that fiscal deficit, it should be 3% of GDP by March 2021, which in the present scenario doesn't seem to be happening. And debt of central government to 40% of GDP by 2024-25. Well, there is a room for deviations also in this. So, in case if some uncertain conditions come up, then there are room for deviations. Of course, COVID is one of the uncertain situations, definitely, right? Then its importance. What is the importance of the FRBM Act? There are many issues in this. I'm just keeping myself near to the two questions which we have just talked about, right? So there are usefulness. Usefulness of the FRBM Act. Well, of course, this is the way of restraining the public spending, eliminating revenue deficit, decreasing fiscal deficit. So it was seen as a way that you can reduce it was seen as a way of restraining public spending eliminating revenue deficit and decrease fiscal deficit. Right? You know what I mean? Government is accountable in the FRBM Act. Government has to tell what is the explicit analysis of the government debt ratio, government debt to GDP ratio. And you can't just say that without any thinking you have just kept on taking up the debt. So you have to tell why the government debt to GDP ratio has increased over the years, if it has increased beyond the manageable limits. So government is asked, government is made accountable in the FRBM Act, right? And you would need, government have to give the explicit analysis government debt to GDP ratio. Government has to give that. Government has to be made accountable for this and its implications, and what are the crowding out implications of this. So other thing is that due to this act, what has happened is that there is a better understanding of the consistency of the fiscal view of each budget which is generated. So there is a consistency, right? There's a consistency that in each budget there will be the fiscal view which will be presented. And we can see how the governments are moving. So in case if they are completely off the targets, they can be asked questions that why they are off the targets. Are you with me? So the main idea of this act is that this is making the processes transparent, and it is making the government accountable. So you have the better understanding of the consistency of the fiscal view with which each budget is generated, right? So there's an understanding of consistency of fiscal view with which each budget is generated. Right, beta? So, and it also tells you that you can envisage that what is a longer term fiscal trajectory. So, if you are completely off the target, you will be made accountable, you will take up steps to reduce them. And what is going to be the fiscal trajectory? How will you reduce the debts? And this will improve the quality of the parliamentary insight also. And it will contribute to a more informed public debate. So basically what we are saying is that it helps in envisaging longer term fiscal trajectory, right? And this will improve the quality of parliamentary insight. It will improve and it will contribute to a more informed public debate, right? So this is this is the usefulness of the FRBM Act. So given the question, you can probably use this much information in order to answer part A of the question. Let's say in part B, so only part A was asked in this paper. Guys, don't worry about whether I've written IES or IAS. This can very well be asked in the IAS exam also. So whether you're preparing for IAS, you're preparing for IES, it doesn't matter. The topic remains same. So you have to know all this, right? You just can't get away with this. So don't worry about this. This could very well be asked in the other papers as well. Even for UGC Net sometimes. You need to know what's going on. Maybe you need to know at least, may not be in this detail, but you still need to know this anyhow. Okay. Then in the part 2 of the question, that is part B, it says what? What are the problems in FRBM Act and what are the solutions? So the idea is that FRBM Act it focused more and more only on the union budget. Right? But the idea is that the government, it should also think about what is happening to the consolidated borrowing requirement of the public sector, right? So in public sector, there are center, state, public sector undertakings, everything. So government should also focus on public sector borrowing requirement. So the Act has not focused explicitly on this. Well, if you look at the India's public sector borrowing requirement, India's public sector borrowing requirement is higher than its fiscal deficit. So, and in recent years, these two have shifted in two different directions. So, this is huge public sector borrowing requirement, and the fiscal deficit of India has been declining definitely, but public sector borrowing requirement, it has been increasing. So, although fiscal deficit is decreasing, but public sector borrowing requirement is increasing over the time. So you also need to focus on the borrowing. You can't just focus on the fiscal deficit. You also need to focus on the public sector borrowing requirement. One thing is that. Then the other problem, which has been discussed, is that when you set up some fiscal rules, those fiscal rules, they should actually focus on the macroeconomic stability. And how do you know that everything is going in a stable fashion in macroeconomy? You need to look at what is the fiscal deficit, what is the primary deficit, what is the debt to GDP ratio, right? So if you look at our fiscal deficit and the debt to GDP ratio, they're much higher than the other emerging markets. For example, you look at other Asian countries, other emerging markets, then you will see that our fiscal deficit and our debt to GDP ratio is much higher than the other countries. So, although the center has made that this debt target, it should be around 40%, but it is still hovering around 60% for center and states. This is still above the average of the other emerging countries. You with me? So, but you also have to understand this, that since our economy is growing, so we can also able to support the higher debt. It is not that problematic. So when you're making the fiscal rules, you have to see this in terms of the complete picture. What is the complete picture which has been provided? So you're making the fiscal rules. One, these fiscal rules, they have to be based on macroeconomic stability. For this, you need to look at what is the fiscal deficit, what is the primary deficit, what is the debt to GDP ratio. You need to look at these things. If you look, as far as India is concerned, fiscal deficit and debt to GDP ratio, it is much higher than other emerging countries. And you've also said, you've also said that other emerging countries, they have on an average 40% as the debt to GDP ratio. Our debt to GDP ratio is somewhat around 60%. So that 60% debt target for the center and state, this is still above the 40% of 40% debt to GDP ratio of the other emerging countries. But you also have to understand that our growth rate is higher as compared to the other emerging countries. So it should not be that problematic. So even for that case, 60% can also be a reasonable target. So you have to see the things in perspective. Just because other emerging nations, they have the debt to GDP ratio of 40%, so you should not be saying that I will also have the debt to GDP ratio of 40%. They don't have that growth rate which we are having. So with higher growth rate, we will be able to achieve we would not have any problem with even a higher debt to GDP ratio. Are you understanding what I'm trying to say? Right? So that's one thing. Then you have, there should be flexibility in the fiscal targets. You know what? You have just set the fiscal target, 3%. Fiscal deficit should be 3%. It should not be more than 3%. Well, this is important because in case if you give the fixed fiscal target, it can really pose a lot of problems. What kind of problems it can pose? There can be cyclical downturn in GDP, right? GDP growth falls, let's say. It will lead to lower revenue. When it will lead to lower revenue, which also means that expenditure also has to be reduced because you do not have income. When you do not have income, your expenditure also has to be reduced. When expenditure also has to be reduced, and why expenditure has to be reduced? Because you want to keep the fiscal deficit target to a fixed target. So what will happen? What I'm trying to say is this, that you need flexibility You need flexibility in fiscal target. Yeah. This is important because in case if you have the fixed fiscal target, it will create a lot of problems. Right? Supposedly, if you have lower growth, this lower growth would mean that in economy, lower revenue is there. Now, you would want a fiscal target. Fiscal deficit is expenditure minus revenue. So, if you have a lower revenue and you have a very high expenditure, it means fiscal deficit will be huge then. If you want to keep the expenditure, you would also, if you want to keep the fiscal deficit to 3% only, you would want expenditure also has to be reduced. Expenditure also has to be reduced. Why? To keep the absolute level of the deficit. To keep the absolute level of the deficit on target. This is the problem. This is the problem because, you know what, the lower GDP, there's a fiscal deficit ratio. So, fiscal deficit ratio. So, in case if there is a lower GDP, then in the fiscal deficit ratio formula, the denominator has reduced. It would mean if you want the ratio of the fiscal deficit to GDP to be constant 3%, then you would also want that fiscal deficit also has to be reduced. So, both of these factors will lead to contraction in expenditures. If the expenditures will be reduced, it will lead to further downturn. That's the problem. You get the point. If expenditures are reduced, it will lead to further downturn. Right? So, how to remove this problem? You can use probably cyclically adjusted fiscal deficit. You understanding what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say because if there is a lower GDP growth, it will lead to lower revenue, but you want to keep the absolute, this target fixed 3% of GDP. So you would want to keep the expenditures also down. But if the expenditures are lower, means you will be cutting salaries or whatever, this will happen to lower income again, and this will lead to lower growth again. So this will perpetuate. The idea is that you should be cyclically adjusted. But this is very, very difficult to measure because, and that too cyclically adjusted because in those data or probably in those countries in which the data is not very highly reliable. Your quarterly data is not very highly reliable. So you also need to give the escape clause. Escape clause. So escape clause is that it can enable that fine, even if you have not met the fiscal deficit target, you can have a departure from there, but in specific circumstances. So those circumstances could be what? Those circumstances could be some, for example, overriding considerations, such as what? Overriding considerations of national security. War, calamities of national proportion, for example, COVID nowadays. Or you can have other consideration could be, you have done such a huge structural reforms in the country. country cannot meet the fiscal deficit target in that particular year, or maybe in some years in the future as well. And those structural reforms, they have some unanticipated fiscal implications. Then also, you would not be able to meet this target. Then decrease in the output growth of at least 3% below the average of the last 4 quarters. Then also you can say that there can be the escape clause there. So escape clause could be there in specific circumstances. So what can be those specific circumstances? I mean, overriding considerations. Of national security. Then far-reaching structural reforms. With unanticipated fiscal implications. Even in those circumstances, you can have deviations, or you might just depart from worrying about meeting the target. Or in case if there is the decrease in output growth. Of at least 3% below average. Of the last 4 quarters. So maybe in those cases, this escape clause, it could be made functional. So this is what you can probably read up. See guys, understand one thing. Indian eco is very, very dynamic. It is changing. So you need to read EPW articles, read books. There is no one book which can help you. So probably Uma Kapila is the best book which I think. You can also use Dattan Sundaram. But again, you will also have to read beyond it also. Because the way they are asking questions now in Indian Economic Services and in IAS Economics Optional, they're asking very dynamic questions. In the sense, dynamic means it's a changing question. So they're not just asking what are the features of FRBM Act. So they're asking also what solutions you provide if or do you think that FRBM Act should be changed? So just reading one book may not be enough to get the complete perspective. So do read up more books also if you